Guy Madison had everything a Hollywood leading man needed: good looks, a chiseled jawline, and that quiet, confident demeanor that made him a box office draw throughout the 1940s and 50s. To the world, he was the image of masculine perfection: tough, stoic, and endlessly charming. Audiences fell in love with his cowboy roles, his action-packed performances, and that easygoing smile that seemed to light up every scene he was in. But behind the curtain, far from the red carpets and film sets, there was a very different version of Guy Madison, one that almost nobody got to see. Back then, Hollywood was an image machine. The studios built their stars from the ground up, crafting not just their careers but their entire lives. Everything from who they were dating to how they dressed was tightly controlled. If a star's real life didn't match the narrative the studio wanted to sell, it was rewritten. And for actors like Madison, this meant keeping some of the most personal parts of their identity locked away behind closed doors. Guy Madison's career was built around the fantasy of the all-American man: rugged, straight-laced, irresistible to women. But despite the endless parade of rumored romances splashed across gossip magazines, something never quite added up. Whispers followed him quietly about the long friendships with other male stars, about the lack of any long-term public relationships, and about how carefully he avoided any personal questions in interviews. These weren't just vague rumors. In certain circles, it was an open secret Madison's private life didn't match the image being sold to the world. This wasn't unusual in Hollywood at the time. Many actors were living double lives, hiding who they really were just to survive in the industry. For them, being honest about their relationships wasn't an option. It could destroy their careers overnight. There were no second chances, no coming out moments that led to redemption arcs. If the public caught wind of anything outside the norm, it was over. And so Madison played the game. Publicly, he dated women, posed for romantic photo ops, and gave just enough away in interviews to keep the illusion intact. But privately, it was a different story. He moved carefully, trusted few people, and kept his personal life behind a wall. In an era where a single misstep could mean scandal, Madison became a master of silence. What's fascinating is how many people today don't know any of this. Madison's legacy is still wrapped in the glossy image of a classic Hollywood cowboy. But once you start peeling back the layers, a much more complicated man begins to emerge. Someone who wasn't just fighting to stay relevant in a cutthroat business, but was also fighting to keep his true self from being discovered. And as we dig deeper into his story, one thing becomes clear: this wasn't just about privacy. It was about survival. But the more Madison tried to bury the truth, the more people around him started to notice something didn't add up. Old Hollywood knew how to tell a story, but the most carefully crafted tales weren't on the screen. They were in the press releases, the photo ops, and the studio-controlled interviews that turned real people into flawless myths. And if you didn't fit the mold, you didn't get to be part of the fantasy. That's the world Guy Madison was dropped into. A place where charm and looks could take you far, as long as you followed the rules and never told the wrong truth. In public, Madison was the kind of star who made headlines just by walking into a room. He was clean-cut, polite, and always seemed just mysterious enough to keep the fans curious. That mystery was no accident. It was carefully managed. Because while the public thought they knew everything about him, there was a whole other story happening just out of view. Studios had a formula. Leading men needed to be straight, desirable, and available, at least in the minds of the women buying movie tickets. If a male actor showed signs of being anything else, the studio stepped in fast. They arranged fake dates, staged tabloid romances, and buried any rumor that might threaten the brand. Actors were told point-blank, "Stay in line, or your career is over." Madison was no fool. He knew how fast Hollywood could turn on you. So he played his part, smiled for the cameras, and kept his real life completely out of sight. But behind closed doors, he was navigating a much riskier world, one filled with quiet meetings, coded conversations, and secret relationships that could never be made public. It was a life of constant vigilance, always watching who was around, what was being said, and how it might be interpreted. There was no real safety net. If someone even suspected something, the fallout could be brutal. Careers were destroyed over less. A single comment, a photograph taken in the wrong place, or a friendship that looked a little too close could trigger a scandal that would end everything. Madison wasn't just hiding relationships, he was living inside a fortress of silence, carefully built to keep the truth from leaking out. It's easy to think of old Hollywood as glamorous, even magical. But for many stars, it was also a prison. Madison's fame came with a contract, unspoken, but very real. He could be adored, but not known. He could be seen, but never truly seen. That's the price of fitting in when you don't fit the mold. And yet, he wasn't alone. Other actors were living the same way, trapped in the same system. Some names you've heard, some you haven't. But one thing's certain, once you start looking beneath the surface, the illusion begins to crack. Because the story of Guy Madison isn't just about one man. It's about an entire era built on keeping secrets. And the deeper you go, the darker it gets. For someone like Guy Madison, survival in Hollywood meant learning who to trust and who to avoid. While the public saw nothing but the cowboy star riding tall on the screen, behind the scenes, he was navigating a hidden world of whispered introductions and late-night rendezvous. Because beneath the surface of the glitzy studio system was a shadow network, one that kept the industry's biggest secrets just out of reach from the tabloids. It was a strange kind of underground. Actors, directors, writers, and studio insiders who all knew the rules and how to work around them. If you were in, you could breathe for a moment. These weren't open declarations or anything that could be traced. This was a world of eye contact, subtle signals, and carefully orchestrated meetings where everything had to look like something else. That's how Madison moved. Quietly, carefully, never reckless, never sloppy. Over time, he became close with others who lived the same way, men whose names you'd recognize if you know your Hollywood history. These weren't casual friendships. In a town where exposure could ruin you, real connection had to be built on absolute trust. For many, that meant forming bonds that were as intimate as they were invisible. Behind closed doors, a very different side of Hollywood came alive. These were the spaces where actors could finally drop the mask. No reporters, no cameras, just people who understood exactly what it felt like to live a lie in public. That shared reality created an intense kind of closeness. And in that closeness, relationships formed, some fleeting, others lasting years. Madison wasn't just a part of this world. He was deeply embedded in it. But nothing in this secret network was ever truly safe. A single rumor in the wrong hands could bring it all crashing down. That's what made everything so fragile and so powerful. The risk of being exposed was constant, but so was the need for connection. And Madison, like so many others, was always walking that tightrope. It wasn't just about romance. It was about identity, validation, a sense that maybe, just maybe, you weren't completely alone. And for someone like Madison, constantly playing a role on and off the screen, these stolen moments were everything. Still, the tension never went away. Even in the safest rooms, there was always a question hanging in the air. What if someone finds out? That fear shaped every move, every decision, every whispered conversation. Because in the end, it wasn't just about protecting a career. It was about protecting lives from a system that didn't care who it destroyed. The deeper Madison got into this hidden world, the more it shaped him. He wasn't just hiding from the public. He was becoming an expert at navigating an entire dual existence. But the line between survival and self-erasure was razor thin. And soon, the pressure of living in the shadows would push Madison to the edge of exposure and toward the most daring decisions of his secret life. Beneath Guy Madison's polished Hollywood image was a side of his life so closely guarded that even whispers of it sent shockwaves through the studio lots. By day, he was the dashing heartthrob adored by women across America. But by night, behind tightly shut doors and under layers of discretion, he was forming connections the public would never have accepted. Relationships that were real, powerful, and completely hidden. The truth? Madison wasn't just navigating secret spaces, he was building secret relationships. And some of those connections were with other men just as famous, just as careful, and just as terrified of the consequences. In the industry's private circles, there were murmurs about names. Familiar ones. Men with chiseled jaws and studio-crafted love lives. just like Madison. Some rumors pointed to leading men who had similar reputations, those who always had a new female co-star on their arm but rarely anything deeper. One name that quietly surfaced more than once was that of a clean-cut actor known for his heroic roles and impossibly perfect public persona. He and Madison had worked in the same studio system, shared overlapping social circles, and were often seen at the same private gatherings. Alone, those facts meant nothing. But in the coded language of Hollywood's underground, they meant everything. Another rumored connection came from within the television world. An actor who rose to fame during the same period as Madison, always carefully paired with leading ladies but never seen with one off-screen. The two reportedly shared more than just screen time. They shared hotel bookings, private dinners, and a chemistry that insiders said was impossible to miss. These weren't just flings. In an environment where the risk of exposure was so high, every relationship had to be built on loyalty and secrecy. That made them intense, all-consuming. And when they ended, they didn't just leave heartbreak, they left fear. Because any former partner now carried the weight of the truth. Madison was known among certain circles as someone who kept his secrets locked up tight. He wasn't reckless. He didn't gossip. That earned him trust in a world where trust was rare. But even he couldn't control everything. Over time, too many patterns emerged. Too many coincidences. People started to notice. And behind the studio smiles and magazine spreads, the tension grew. He wasn't the only one. There were others, names still whispered today, who lived the same way, hiding in plain sight. Madison's story is just one thread in a larger web, a glimpse into a hidden Hollywood most people never saw. But unlike some of his peers, Madison seemed to be keeping a mental list of the people who truly mattered. The ones who knew him not just as a star, but as a man. And eventually, when the timing was right and the danger high enough, he would start talking. Not in the headlines, not in interviews, but in private conversations where he began to quietly reveal the names of the men who had meant something more. But the question was never just who. It was why now. For years, Guy Madison had mastered the art of silence. It was his armor, his shield, and the single most powerful weapon he had to protect himself. But no matter how tightly you seal a secret, pressure always finds a way to build. And by the late 1950s, Madison wasn't just carrying one secret, he was carrying years of them. Quiet romances, hidden truths, constant fear. The weight of that life didn't just sit in the background. It changed him. On the outside, he was still the same Hollywood staple, handsome, well-mannered, a safe bet for producers who needed a reliable leading man. But behind the scenes, cracks were starting to show. Friends noticed the shift first. Madison, once relaxed and easygoing, began to pull back. He avoided long shoots, declined public appearances, and stopped playing the studio's publicity games. Some chalked it up to burnout. But those closest to him knew better. He wasn't tired. He was suffocating. Madison had spent years keeping everything compartmentalized. One version of himself for the cameras, another for the quiet corners of his real life. But the two worlds were starting to collide. The gossip columns were getting bolder. Studio heads were growing suspicious. A few too many coincidences had piled up, shared vacations with unnamed friends, unexplained absences, vague stories that didn't quite add up. One studio executive reportedly gave Madison a warning cloaked in a compliment. "You're too good to lose, but don't give them anything to talk about." Translation: stay in line or disappear. Madison had heard variations of that threat before, but this time it felt different. He wasn't just hiding from the public anymore. He was hiding from the people signing his checks. And then came the whisper that pushed everything into overdrive. Someone was talking. Maybe a former lover. Maybe a jealous rival. Maybe just a well-connected insider who saw too much. But whatever the source, the buzz was growing. Guy Madison might not be who people thought he was. And in an industry that thrived on image, that kind of rumor could be lethal. For Madison, this wasn't just a professional threat, it was deeply personal. Everything he'd built, every role he'd played, was now under a magnifying glass. And for the first time in his career, the fear that had always lingered in the background surged to the front. He could lose everything. Not just fame, but safety, privacy, reputation, the ability to move through the world without people pointing and whispering. And in that pressure cooker, something shifted. Madison stopped trying to bury everything. Quietly, cautiously, he began to share small pieces of the truth, but only with people he trusted. A friend here, a former co-star there. He wasn't making confessions, he was telling his story on his own terms, testing the waters, watching the reactions. And in those private conversations, he began naming names, not to shame, not to shock, but to be heard for once, not as the man everyone thought they knew, but as the man he truly was. Because sometimes staying silent isn't strength. Sometimes it's surrender. When Guy Madison started speaking, he didn't make a scene. There was no tell-all interview, no dramatic expose. That wasn't his style, and it would have been career suicide. Instead, the truth came out in fragments, shared only in trusted company, during the kinds of conversations where the room goes quiet and everyone leans in just a little closer. And that's where the real intrigue begins. Because the names he mentioned weren't just anyone. They were men who had stood in the same spotlight, smiled for the same cameras, and lived the same double lives. Some of them were still alive, still famous, still pretending. And others, long gone, their legacies polished clean by history, while the truth was buried right alongside them. One name that came up quietly, but unmistakably, belonged to an actor who had built an image of rugged masculinity, starring in war epics and westerns that made him an icon. Off-screen, he was known for being intensely private, almost cold, and rarely seen with anyone outside of work. To the public, he was just another aloof, mysterious leading man. But to Madison, he'd been something more, someone who understood, without needing to say a word. Another rumor connection was far more surprising, a young actor who had exploded into stardom, only to vanish just as quickly. Whispers suggested he and Madison shared something real, something emotional, until the studio found out. The fallout was swift. That actor's career didn't just stall, it evaporated. His name faded from marquees, and Madison never mentioned him again. But the silence around that relationship spoke volumes. These weren't just flings. They weren't gossip-fueled affairs. These were the relationships that left marks, private, painful, and unforgettable. Madison didn't share them lightly. He spoke their names like confessions, not for drama, but for release. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't pretending. He was remembering. There was risk in every revelation. Even years later, Madison understood the danger. If the wrong person repeated what they'd heard, the entire illusion could collapse. But maybe that was part of the point. Maybe after decades of playing the perfect man, he was ready to be something else, even if it meant sacrificing the myth. What's even more chilling is how many of the men he named were never linked publicly, never suspected, never outed. Their secrets died with them, or were carefully preserved by estates and studios determined to keep the image intact. Madison's memories, shared in confidence, may be the only surviving pieces of those hidden lives. And still, he never named all of them. Some relationships were too personal, too vulnerable. Others too dangerous. But he left just enough of a trail, just enough truth, for those willing to look between the lines. Because behind every Hollywood smile is a story. And Madison's story wasn't just about who he loved. It was about the cost of keeping that love invisible. And as the years wore on, the cost would only grow. By the time Guy Madison reached the peak of his fame, the walls he'd built around his personal life were starting to close in. The pressure of secrecy didn't just weigh on his relationships. It began bleeding into every part of his life. Because in Hollywood, when you're constantly acting off-screen too, something eventually cracks. Madison had mastered the performance. He smiled when he was told to. He dated the women the studio paired him with. He showed up, hit his marks, and kept the machine running. But behind the polished exterior was a man growing tired of the lies, the cover stories, the double life. And most of all, tired of pretending the most important parts of his life never happened. He wasn't alone. Others in his orbit were unraveling too, some turning to substances, others disappearing entirely. The toll of living in the shadows was real, and Madison was starting to feel it. Friends described him in later years as more withdrawn, more introspective. Still kind, still charming, but always carrying something just beneath the surface. Like he was haunted by a version of himself he never got to live. Professionally, his star began to dim. Hollywood was changing. The golden age was giving way to a grittier, more rebellious era, and Madison's clean-cut image started to feel dated. He wasn't getting the big roles anymore. The studios that once protected him were now chasing new faces, younger stories. And Madison, despite all his careful maneuvering, couldn't stop the slow fade. Some whispered that the rumors had finally caught up to him, that the quiet revelations he'd shared in trusted circles had been overheard by the wrong people, that producers were suddenly hesitant, that casting directors had started using phrases like too much baggage, nothing provable, nothing on paper. Just that steady, unmistakable shift from sought after to forgotten. For Madison, the silence had always been a shield. But now it started to feel like a cage. The things he couldn't say, the people he couldn't acknowledge, the life he couldn't name, had slowly cut him off from the very world he once lit up. And what's worse, he knew it. He saw it happening in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it without blowing it all up. So he didn't. He stayed quiet. But inside, that quiet turned into something else, regret. Not just about the relationships lost or the career that slipped away, but about the truth he never got to live out loud. The love stories that had no photos. The partners who existed only in memory. The life he had, but never really got to have. And still, he never named names publicly. Never broke the code. Because for Madison, loyalty ran deeper than legacy. He built his world in the shadows, and he'd keep those shadows safe, even if it cost him everything. But deep down, a question lingered, one he couldn't shake. Had the silence protected him or erased him? Guy Madison never had a public breakdown. No scandals, no headlines, no dramatic fall from grace. His exit from a spotlight was quiet, just like the life he kept hidden for so long. But the absence said just as much as any tabloid ever could. Madison didn't disappear because he wanted to. He faded because he had to. The world had changed, but not enough. The freedom he might have craved in his youth, the kind that could have let him live honestly, without fear, was still decades away. And by the time cracks in the system began to show, it was too late. His prime had passed, and so had many of the men who had walked that secret road alongside him. There's something especially tragic about that kind of invisibility. Madison lived through moments that shaped him, relationships that defined him, but they're gone now, undocumented, unnamed. No red carpets, no photos, no interviews, just memories slowly dissolving into time. And for a man who lived under constant scrutiny, the most meaningful parts of his life were the ones no one was allowed to see. There's heartbreak in that. Not just the romantic kind, though he certainly knew it, but the deeper heartbreak of being forgotten in plain sight, of knowing that the story people tell about you is only half the truth, and realizing the missing half might never be known. Because when your most important memories are tied to people you can't mention, even nostalgia becomes dangerous. In his later years, those who spent time with Madison described him as both warm and distant. He could be funny, open, even flirtatious, but always with a line that couldn't be crossed. He had stories he wanted to tell, names he wanted to say, but decades of conditioning had trained him too well. You don't survive Hollywood by being reckless. You survive by knowing when to shut the door, turn down the volume, and pretend you've got nothing to hide. And yet, there were glimpses. Small, almost imperceptible moments where Madison's guard would drop, just for a second. A lingering look when a certain name came up. A pause before answering a question about the past. A smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Those were the tells. The subtle signals that said, there's more to this story. But he never wrote a memoir. Never left behind letters or confessions. If Madison kept a record, it died with him. All were left with are fragments, rumors, whispers, patterns in the silence, and the rare, quiet confirmations from those who knew him best. What's striking is that even as the world became more open, Madison never changed his tune. He had spent too many years hiding to suddenly risk truth at the finish line. And maybe that was his final act of love for the men he'd been with and for the version of himself they helped him protect. Because in a world that punished honesty, silence wasn't just survival. It was devotion. By the time Guy Madison passed away in 1996, the Hollywood landscape had already started to change. Slowly, cautiously, the industry was beginning to acknowledge the hidden histories of its stars, the ones who never had the chance to live their truth. But Madison wasn't around to see it. And perhaps that's the cruelest part. The world softened too late. In his prime, he was the kind of actor people remembered for his face, chiseled, camera-ready, a product of the studio era's obsession with image. But what was behind that image was far more compelling than any Western he ever shot or love scene he ever faked. He was a man who lived with discipline, restraint, and a quiet kind of courage. Not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that keeps you standing when the world wants you to vanish. Yet his name rarely comes up in conversations about queer history in Hollywood. He left no written confessions, no grand revelations. And that silence, while understandable, has consequences. It erases him from the stories where he belongs. It lets the myth outlive the man. And in doing so, it steals a kind of justice that so many of his peers also never received, the right to be remembered as they truly were. But here's what makes Madison's story matter. What makes it endure despite the silence? He was part of something bigger. A quiet network of men who built the golden age from the inside, navigating a system designed to erase them. His decisions, his sacrifices, even his silences, those weren't just about self-preservation. They were acts of protection, not just for himself, but for everyone he loved and couldn't name. There are younger stars today, open, unapologetic, celebrated, who will never know what it meant to survive in Madison's world. And that's a good thing. That progress is proof that people like him mattered, even if they never got to see the impact of the path they carved. Even if their names aren't etched into Pride retrospectives or celebrated in award season tributes, they were the foundation. The quiet ones, the invisible ones. And while Madison never claimed his truth publicly, those who heard the whispers, those he trusted with the real story, carry it forward. It exists in the margins, in unspoken acknowledgments, in the space between what was said and what was lived. Because sometimes legacy isn't about what you leave behind in headlines or awards. Sometimes it's about what survives in the silence. The stories passed on in hushed voices. The truths known only to a few, but felt by many. Madison didn't get the spotlight in the end. But he was never really after it. He just wanted to live. And in a world that didn't want him to, that was revolutionary enough. In the end, Guy Madison's life wasn't defined by what he said, but by what he didn't say. The truth was always there, just beneath the surface, whispered among the few who knew him well, buried in the stories of Hollywood's golden age that would never be told in full. But it was never truly lost. It was only waiting for the right time to come to light. It's easy to dismiss Madison's secrecy as just another byproduct of an era that was too conservative, too afraid to let people live their truth. But the deeper you look, the more you see that his silence wasn't a simple act of submission. It was a carefully crafted choice, a defense mechanism that kept him safe in a world that demanded conformity at all costs. And as much as we could talk about the men he loved, the secrets he kept, the what-ifs that never got the chance to unfold, there's something undeniably powerful in the way he navigated his world. He didn't just survive Hollywood, he outlasted it. While Hollywood today celebrates authenticity, back then it was all about maintaining an illusion. Men like Madison knew that they could either stay true to themselves and risk everything, or they could play the game and keep what mattered to them safe. For Guy Madison, the game meant silence. The truth remained his private treasure, a small rebellion in a system designed to strip him of his identity. What makes Madison's story so compelling is that it's not just about the struggle for love or the pain of hidden desires. It's about resilience in the face of a world that tells you to stay invisible. And despite the silence that surrounded him, Madison had the power to carve out his own space. He was a man of few words, but those words, when spoken, meant everything. And so his legacy isn't found in the roles he played or the headlines he never made. It's found in the quiet rebellion of living a life that refused to fit into anyone else's mold. His life is a reminder that history isn't just written in the open. It's also crafted in the shadows, in the parts of ourselves that we keep hidden away, in the relationships we protect, the truths we withhold, and the love that blooms outside the gaze of an unforgiving world. Madison might not have gotten the recognition he deserved during his lifetime, but that doesn't mean he wasn't a pioneer. His quiet defiance, his refusal to be anyone other than who he was, even if the world never saw it, made him a part of something bigger. A movement not led by headlines or awards, but by those who dared to live differently, even when no one was watching. And now, in the light of day, we can finally begin to see the whole story. Not just of Guy Madison, but of the countless men and women like him who lived in the shadows of Hollywood's most glittering days. Their stories are finally being told, not as scandals or rumors, but as histories of strength, resilience, and love that transcended the limitations of the world they knew. Because in the end, Guy Madison didn't just survive Hollywood, he changed it. And perhaps, for a man who never sought the spotlight, that was always the ultimate victory.